Okay, so next we have one of our own, Chris Metzler, who's also co-organizer of this symposium. So Chris is in CS. He's an assistant professor. He's one of our junior speakers. Even so, I'm not sure if he still qualifies. Look at his list of awards, so I don't think he's that junior. I don't remember much, but one that stuck to my mind was the FOSR YIP, which is very prestigious. Chris works in image processing on the computational side combined with machine learning. Initially, when I asked him to give a talk, he kind of said he's not a robotics person, but then looking at what he does, I think we as robotics people have a lot to learn from what he does. So Chris.
Cool. Well, thanks. So today I'd like to talk to you about inverse differentiable rendering, which is a general purpose framework for multimodal 3D sensing. Like Halen said, I'm robotics adjacent. You can think of the robotics life cycle as sensing, perceiving, acting, in a loop. And essentially, all of my research is focusing on that sensing stage. So how can we develop computational imaging, computational sensing systems, better radars, better cameras, better LiDARs, things like that, to sort of improve the overall robotics life cycle. I lead the Intelligent Sensing Laboratory, and essentially, our goal is to combine machine learning, physics and optics, and statistical signal processing to improve the performance of sensing systems. And the applications we're particularly interested in are essentially scenarios where conventional cameras, conventional LiDARs, conventional radars, conventional sonars aren't going to be super effective. So sort of four motivating applications that my lab is focused on considerably is sensing through obscurance. So how can we see through tissue? How can we see through fog? How can we see through atmospheric turbulence? Sensing around obstacles. How can we turn walls into mirrors? How can we do non-line of sight sensing? Sensing at extreme ranges and resolutions. So light-based synthetic aperture imaging, and sensing in contested environments. How can we sense when we have adversaries present, when we have others trying to disrupt us? And the hope is that by developing the better these tools, these better sensing systems, we can provide scientists, biologists, astronomers, the national defense, better capabilities and enable new discoveries. So in terms of sensing through obscurance, a large focus in my group has been on imaging through scattering. So that's whether that's imaging through fog, scattering that changes very quickly on the macroscopic scale, or things like imaging through tissue. How can we see tumors through a millimeter of tissue, things like that. Identify cancer without a biopsy. We want to image through atmospheric turbulence, so really long-range imaging where conventional camera would record something like that, and can we develop better post-processing algorithms or adaptive optic systems to see clearly at kilometer ranges. And if you really want to push these performance of these systems, maybe you do active illumination. So how can we use laser illumination to see very far, potentially with scattering present, see-through fog, things like that. Or more mundane applications like just imaging through glass. So shown here, we have a composite scene, which is we have an aquarium with some objects in it. And as you move your camera around, you see the superposition of what's behind the glass and what's in front of the glass. And we've developed algorithms that can take something like that and decompose it into what's in front of you and what's behind you. Non-line of sight sensing, so sensing around obstacles. Much of my postdoc work was focused on how can we see inside a room where we only have access to a keyhole. So leverage inverse synthetic aperture radar type ideas to reconstruct the trajectory and shape of a hidden object inside a room, with no light that goes directly between the sensor and the obstacle. The only thing we can perceive is the small amount of light that makes it off that wall to the target back into the sensor. We had a fun side project without many obvious applications where my students stood in front of a camera. We captured essentially a series of reflections as their head moves around, and you can reconstruct the coarse 3D geometry of what's in front of them. We are focused on sensing at extreme ranges and resolution, whether this is temporal, spatial, what have you. We're working with collaborators in various microscopy departments to do super resolved light-based imaging. And then recently have been again applying inverse synthetic aperture radar ideas to hopefully reconstruct high resolution satellite images using low resolution diffraction limited measurements and leveraging the fact that a satellite rotates as it passes above you. And then sensing in incandescent environments, low probability to detect radar systems, computationally efficient, sample efficient, ultra wideband radar systems, and what have you. And one theme that connects many of these research topics is that we're very interested in multimodal sensing. So how can we combine modalities at different wavelengths, different sound, light, RF, to combine the high resolution of a light-based system with the great penetration capabilities of sonar, RF, something like that. The motivation for this again is that you're capturing complementary information with these different sensors. So the conventional cameras you use every day have incredible lateral resolution. You can get 50 megapixel sensors for under $1,000. LiDARs, radars, sonars give you great axial resolution. They can tell you how far away things are. Range information. Hyperspectral cameras give you better spectral resolution, so many wavelengths. Event cameras, as was mentioned earlier, give you great temporal resolution at a pretty sort of computationally efficient, power efficient form factor. Polarization cameras give you scatter rejection capabilities and material discrimination capabilities. And infrared cameras, terahertz sensors, things like that can perform clutter and background suppression, see-through obscurance. So clearly there's a huge motivation for integrating these various modalities and the complementary information about their environments they're capturing, and to fuse it together to get the best of both. So the drones we saw earlier, Waymo's cars, in a sort of any sort of sensing system, is trying to combine this disparate information and to make sense of it. Much of what my group has been focusing on is just 3D scene reconstruction. So inevitably, once you have that information, you want to do downstream planning, tasks, inference, things like that. But if you can do 3D reconstruction, that's sort of a sufficient statistic. Maybe not necessary, but if you can do that, you can presumably do most of those other tasks. Multimodal sensing, is obviously pretty challenging, and it's not a new idea. It's been studied for 50 years, 60 years, and there's been all sorts of algorithms that have been developed from space carving, you name it, and like most things, or most computer vision type applications, over the last decade, machine learning has just dominated the performance of these systems. And today, the state-of-the-art sensor fusion algorithms are by and large, at least for the low-level sensor fusion, machine learning based. You synthesize or capture just vast amounts of training data, and then train a CNN or a transformer, some sort of network architecture that fuses that and reconstructs what's in front of you. And sort of the big limitation with that, the central limitation with that approach, is that whatever you create, by and large, is going to be modality specific, and maybe even sensor specific. So what you have for LiDAR will not work for radar. It might not even work for LiDAR from a different manufacturer. So is there an algorithmic framework that we can develop that can integrate sort of any type of sensor? And arguably, inverse differentiable rendering, is that framework that allows you to combine sort of any modality. So if you've been following the computer vision community, you may have seen a video like this. So there's this idea of neural radiance fields, Gaussian splatting, all these various technologies that they're doing essentially novel view synthesis. So you wave a camera around, you train a neural network to represent that scene, And now you can, sort of move that camera around virtually and, render new views. And you can get sort of, really photorealistic, perceptually, perfect 3D reconstructions using this technology, with, typically developed, for RGB imagery. Inverse differentiable rendering is pretty conceptually straightforward. You start off with some 3D representation of the scene, might be a neural network, might be sort of a Gaussian splatting, sort of a generalization of a voxel-based representation. You have that scene representation, and then sort of the meat of the approach, why this is so effective, is you have a differentiable rendering engine, a computationally efficient differentiable rendering engine that models, if this reconstruction of the scene was correct, what would I see? What would my predicted observations look like? So I have some 3D reconstruction. I render, well, if this was correct, this is what my RGB images would look like. Inevitably, when you initialize, it doesn't look anything like it. You compare the two, backpropagate, and reconstruct that representation, and rinse and repeat, and eventually you become consistent with those measurements, and hopefully your measurements are sufficiently constrained that you've reconstructed an accurate 3D representation of the scene. And this very naturally extends to multimodal sensing. If you have a physical model for the RGB and have a physical differentiable physical model for the sonar, I take my 3D reconstruction, I predict what would I see with the RGB, what would I predict see with the sonar, compare the two, backpropagate, and fuse these two modalities. And this sort of general purpose approach has been applied to LiDAR sensor fusion, polarization cameras, and various other modalities. What I'd like to talk about today is our own work in fusing sonar and RGB imagery using inverse differentiable rendering, and fusing RGB and event cameras using inverse differentiable rendering. And this is joint work with Michael Kais's and Aditya Petaredla's groups at CMU and Dartmouth, respectively. So, there's all sorts of applications for which you'd want to, see image reconstruct underwater construction, marine biology and ecology, archaeology, you name it. And in many of these applications, you are limited by your range of motion. Maybe you have a torpedo-based submersible that is doing survey. It's not moving around and capturing 3D images of a scene. It passes by the scene once and probably isn't going to pass by again. Maybe you're in a physically constrained operating environment or a fragile environment where you just don't want to move around for whatever reason. So in many of these applications, you have a very restricted baseline. You're not capturing 3D coverage of a scene. And I should say, in clear water conditions, if you have 360-degree coverage, you don't need sonars. Cameras are going to work relatively well. But in this restricted baseline scenario, if you capture a set of images like that, without prior information, without additional constraints, you can't get a 3D reconstruction, an accurate 3D reconstruction. You're under constrained. Sonar gives you depth information, but it's pretty low resolution. So how do you fuse those modalities to get the lateral resolution from RGB and the depth resolution from sonar? So conceptually, you can think of a sonar measurement as projecting along the depth axis. You have a uniform linear array. It performs beamforming. You get range information. You get azimuthal information. And in effect, but the elevation information is collapsed. And so in effect, you've taken your scene and projected it onto this image plane. Same thing goes with radar. And by contrast, a camera is projecting onto that plane. So you have an optical image projecting this way, a sonar measurement projecting that way. And if you think about the information those are capturing under this restricted baseline scenario, if we have, two images, sort of this, think of a stereo imaging system with, RGB, I might, identify that pixel and that pixel have correspondence, which is to say, they came from the same 3D space. And if the baseline's small, when I project back, that uncertainty and that uncertainty, there's a large, depth ambiguity. The 3D point was anywhere in that range. By contrast, that sonar, which is projected onto the elevation axis, has an ambiguity in that direction, where here elevation is along here. Intuitively, if I have a point that I can register, belongs, here with the cameras, here with the sonars, I can, combine those constraints and localize it both laterally with the camera and, axially with the sonar. I will skip through the equations, but essentially, following through sort of standard techniques introduced by Shahryar Nagaripour, you can characterize the how well you can triangulate using these complementary modalities. You can set up a linear system that says this is by solving the system, inverting the system, I can triangulate a point in 3D, and you can create that system for a camera, a sonar, or the multimodal sensing system, and have these matrices that describe the triangulation performance, and compare how well conditioned are these, how invertible are these systems. And as you might hope, the multimodal system is much better conditioned, can sort of fundamentally perform better triangulation. So we took this framework and applied it to RGB sonar fusion. So again, it's this inverse differentiable framework where you have the scene representation, predict the measurements, back project and reconstruct, render and reconstruct. So you have essentially a pipeline for the camera, pipeline for the sonar, integrate the two, and back project into the 3D representation. And so we have various objects, and then we reconstructed them using an optical system, acoustic system, optical acoustic system as the baseline got smaller and smaller. And as you get more and more smaller and smaller baseline, you lose resolution in the axial dimension with the optical, whereas the sonar is just always never has the lateral resolution you want, whereas the combined system works quite well. So we took that algorithm, working with our partners at CMU, took a sonar, did some sonar, a RGB camera, mounted it, captured a 3D measurement of an object, and got these reconstructions that are consistent, even over very small baselines, quarter of a meter. So this is sort of pretty preliminary work. And so what we're working on now, in collaboration with Russ and Sai in the audience, is getting this thing to really work out in the field. So how can we perform RGB sonar sensor fusion to reconstruct in low visibility conditions, really take advantage of the fact that we're getting complementary information from the sonar. So we're currently working in the MRC neutral buoyancy pool to reconstruct things in low light. We're working nearby to image in murky water, and then a few weeks ago, Russ and Sai and my student Isabel went out to Alaska to try to reconstruct the geometry of icebergs. Cool. Change gears a bit. So this is joint work with Giannis and Cornelia and Heng, and they're great students. So how can we combine RGB and sonar, RGB and event cameras? So event camera imagery looks like that. It's incredibly high frames per second, but it's essentially binary. This pixel get brighter or dimmer. Whereas as you're moving, have really fast ego motion, you're going to get a blurry and you don't have 1,000 frames per second. And I just want to point out here that these are emulated results. So what we did was put a high-speed camera on a drone and then synthesize this. So I just want to be clear. But using that imagery there versus that imagery there, you can get much better sort of novel view synthesis. So this is sort of the 3D reconstruction of the scene, and here you can see the depth map. So much better results with the help of this high frame rate motion artifact free imagery you're capturing from an event camera. Conceptually, this is that same inverse differentiable rendering framework where you have some representation. In this case, we're going to use 3D Gaussians. Predict, what would we see using that representation? Compare the two, and update that representation to be consistent with the observations. And using that, you can get accurate 3D reconstructions. And this can generalize to real data as well. And we're currently working to integrate this system with AI-based priors and further improve the performance. So in conclusion, inverse differentiable rendering is a general purpose framework for multimodal 3D reconstruction. Without training data, you can so long as you have a physical model for the the measurement process, you can apply this framework and integrate essentially arbitrary modalities. And this work was possible thanks to my many collaborators and generous funding agencies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very nice talk. So there is something which is called symbolic fusion, where basically I think what you're doing is a special case of that in the general framework, which means that if I have data from different sensors, then I can introduce some logic in what they are trying, like in this case, you're using geometry, different angles, and so on and so forth. Okay, so am I correct that this is?
Yeah.
I'm not saying that you're not doing something interesting. I'm saying this symbolic fusion is very important because a lot of people, when they try to do fuse data, if you do it statistically without thinking about exactly what you're doing, like the environment and the geometry and so on and so forth, you're going to get a lot of problems, right?
Yeah.
And this generalizes. But the real question I want to ask you is, now that you have that, and especially with event cameras, this opens up the opportunity to actually focus on important features by applying multi-resolution understanding of the data. Any direction in that? Because we humans do that all the time. We look at objects in multiple resolutions and very quickly identify the features we want. And this connects to attention and variable attention mechanisms and so on and so forth. Have you done anything like that, or are you doing anything like that?
I have some students sort of broadly thinking about that. I guess my group's strength is at that sort of, right at that intersection of the hardware and sort of changing the hardware. So I guess sort of to improve the sensing, and then with the assumption that then helps the navigation, things like that. I think perhaps the most similar work, I don't know if it's similar, but hopefully it's interesting work, is modifying the optics to suppress features you don't care about or to encode additional information. So we have sort of event cameras with coded optics, where now we get sort of depth dependent blur in the images, blur in the events. And so essentially using optical encoding so that the measurements you get tell you something about depth. So I think Nitri is presenting sort of the RGB version of that later on today, and she was doing visual odometry. But I'm not sure that answers your question, but that's the closest we've gotten. Yeah.
So, I'm sorry. The integration across different modalities.
Yep.
The other thing with sensor fusion is the integration over time. And it seemed like you were set up for that with the image that was in the middle. I recall you had a slide where you were generating predicted observations and then back propagating difference between the predicted and actual. So that's it seems like a Bayesian approach to this, and recursive Bayesian would be that you're doing this over time. So is that something that you're working on?
Yeah. So everything we're doing now, or not everything we're doing now, everything I showed is static scene. So, essentially it doesn't matter when you sensed, the order at which you sensed is, doesn't matter. We are now working to, reconstruct with dynamic scenes. Is that sort of, where that
Whether
matters?
the scene is dynamic or not, the notion from like classical estimation theory is that as you assimilate noisy observations, you can enhance your perception of the signal, whether the signal is time varying or not. So I'm just curious if the notion of integration over time is coming into play here.
So I guess maybe approaching this from different jargon, but
Yeah.
I guess we are exploring sort of active sensing. So once I have this noisy reconstruction of the scene, I have some notion of, well, I'm certain of this location, and I can go uncertain there, and I can go explore. Is that sort of the dynamics that you have?
Yeah, certainly that would be an application of
Okay.
it. Yeah, the question is whether or not you're, in order to reconstruct the scene at time t, are
Yep.
you using observations only from time t, or are you using
No.
historical observations?
Yeah, so historic sort of yeah, so we have a sort of, I guess didn't get into it, but sort of a nice thing about this representation is it can, if you have a neural representation of the scene, which I didn't get into, you can make that function of XYZ, of course, but also XYZT. And the benefit there over, say, a frame-by-frame based representation is that any regularity that occurs, and there's always going to be regularity, the scene isn't independent T1 to T2, is naturally captured in that representation. And sort of, you can think of these networks as trying to sort of parsimoniously represent the scene, and without encoding without me telling it, hey, T1 and T2 are related, the easiest way for me to reconstruct T1 and T2 is to have them be very similar and have some sort of flow like sort of under the hood flow but like interpolation between them. Yeah, sorry.
Hey, hi, Professor.
Hey.
Yeah, thank you for sharing such an insightful information. I just have a small query. Like, you were talking about usage in the fields. Let's say, consider an autonomous underwater vehicle. We have a lot of constraints, such as battery constraint or computational constraint on board. So if someone wants to do the 3D reconstruction of using both sonar and camera on board inside an AUV, there's a lot of constraints regarding that, like the battery usage and all.
Yeah.
How do we tackle that situation?
Yeah, so we're addressing that question, slightly right now. So as Russ sort of told me, turns out, at least in the deep sea, 3D reconstruction, the biggest draw on these UUVs is the floodlights. Just pumping your own light down there. And so we're currently exploring, can we do, or is this framework improve the power consumption of sensing, reduce the power consumption of sensing? Our reconstruction pipeline is still pretty expensive, to the point that, this is maybe better suited for you navigate through, you record these measurements, and then, all right, after the fact, you reconstruct, here's the very accurate 3D reconstruction after some preliminary real-time thing. But yeah.
Thank you.
You're trying to reconstruct rigid bodies like this. How are you representing the state of something that complicated?
Yeah, so two approaches. So the left, where you sort of skimmed over the details. The left, we have a neural network, untrained neural network, and we train it to be consistent with the observations. So neural network, I give it XYZ, and it says how far are you away from the surface. So it has a surface-based representation, and essentially, what that's plotting there is the f equals 0 contour plot of that neural representation. On the right, we're using 3D Gaussians. So essentially represent your scene as a set of ellipses, thousands of ellipses of, shape and, radius. When you render, you sort of superimpose all those on top of each other.
Are you assuming perfect information about your robot pose from some external source, or?
We have a follow-up work where we, I think under review at the moment, where we refine the pose. So sort of because this whole thing is differentiable, you can make the pose estimates differentiable as well.
Gotcha. Have you looked at pose estimation from a known scene at all, or not?
I mean, that's something I guess we have to do to calibrate in the first place, but I don't know if there's a research question there, or I understood it. I think there's maybe another question. Yeah.
Hey, Chris, that was a really nice talk. I really enjoyed it. I had a question about the multimodal part.
Yeah.
So how do you know, or have you thought about which modes you would need in order to achieve the particular task? For example, is there any way to infer that from the loss or the construction of the loss? Which modes might be most informative? Have you thought about that problem yet?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, certainly when we re-render, we can sort of look at the mismatch between this modality and the next.
Because I could imagine that in some cases, an additional mode might be helpful or might be less helpful. And so if there was a way to kind of reason about that quantity.
Yeah, so I guess the point I struggle with a little bit is even if you get the mode, I can re-render this mode perfectly. I can perfectly resynthesize the sonar. If the sonar is under-constrained, sort of under-constrains the 3D geometry, I could have, sort of a completely degenerate 3D geometry, which is perfectly consistent with that mode. So it's, I think that sort of conditioning matrix is sort of the way to think about it. But doing that on a more active, sensing framework is something we're thinking about, but yeah.
Cool, thanks. That was awesome. And we
Thanks.
can chat more at the break also.
That's great.
Thank you, Chris.